Thanks. I'm not gonna read from that. But I think it's pretty good, the stories I wrote in it. I'm gonna read from a book I'm working on, which takes place half when these characters are 17 and the other half when they're 27. And yeah, I'd just like to dedicate this to all my sweet friends that came out tonight. Really appreciate you guys. And it's going to be slightly PG-13, I think, for the young book fans in the house. This takes place in high school for these people. It felt very good to me running like this, wearing only boxers, socks, and shoes. The four of us were moving towards a nearby park, fanned out in a loose formation, and observing our surroundings. Neighborhood patrol was one of the best ideas we had ever had. Henry was a few lengths in front of me. The big, puffy skate shoes he had on made his body look extra scrawny. He resembled a child running around in his father's high tops. Mark trailed behind, not because he was slow, but because he liked to take more detours, dancing badly in a random driveway, rubbing his butt on a Lexus, and jumping over a couple of hedges on the way. I was in the middle of the street, carrying an ADT home security sign in my right hand. I had excavated the small blue sign from a paranoid lawn, and the moist dirt still clung to the metal stake. Winston was on the sidewalk, parallel to me, and he had an orange construction cone on his head. I watched the reflective tip of the construction cone brighten. "Car!" Henry yelled. We instinctively dashed out of the street, nimble like wild animals, splitting up and then crouching in different front yards. It was after midnight, and Winston's neighborhood was mostly quiet. Along the street, lonely porch lights glowed, illuminating locked doors and not much else. The car, an old Porsche, I think, drove slowly by, as if it had seen something out of place, had caught a confusing glimpse of a pack of young, half-naked boys dissolving into the dark. I watched the car from behind a mature sycamore tree, and my hands unconsciously rubbed the rough bark. I hoped that whoever was inside the car had seen us. Even though we tried as a rule to avoid cars and people, part of the reason we ran around in our underwear was to be seen, to surprise and confuse whoever lived in this pretty boring neighborhood. "Piece of poop," Mark whispered from a nearby driveway. Once the car had turned onto a side street, I walked to where I could see Mark holding one of his arms. "What's up?" "I dove and landed in a rose bush," she said. A few feet away, the rose bush lay uprooted and on its side, bulldozed by Mark. Pink petals were spread out and moving around us on the ground. Mark took some of the blood from his arm and wiped it on his boxer shorts, then licked the wound. He blinked rapidly, his blue eyes very aware. "It's just a scratch or two." Henry and Winston met up with us, and we decided to walk the remaining few blocks to the park, now sticking to the borders of yards. On the way, I could feel the cool air as it curled around my body that was warm with alcohol. The neighborhood park was a small, oval-shaped island of green grass, some shrubs, and a few sizable oak trees. There were no benches or picnic tables, no playground. Off to one side of the park was a seemingly random circle of high bushes, with a small gap that allowed an entrance to a clearing within. Inside this protected clearing was a space large enough to hold the four of us. The dense perimeter of plants shielded whoever was inside from public view. We entered this circle and stood around for a minute. We talked about this idea, how we wanted to spend the night at school once our final year began, to bring a tent and a stove and set up camp in the quad. We thought this would be incredibly funny. The teachers and other students wouldn't know what to think about us when they arrived, wouldn't know why we were there or what, if anything, we were trying to prove, and we wouldn't know either. We just liked the idea. Winston left the circle to pee, and I stashed my security sign under one of the bushes with a few others I had collected over the summer. Henry was moving around a lot and holding himself. "My titties are cold." "Your titties are small," Mark replied, and tried in vain to squeeze them. Henry swatted Mark away before rubbing his shaved head and looking down, contemplating his tiny titties. They looked like a couple of sweet tarts stuck to Henry's smooth chest. I was stretching my arms high above my head and then pumping my legs quickly, jogging in place because my body felt strong, flexible, and totally capable of anything. "I feel really good," I said. Mark nodded. "It's the fresh nighttime air, smell it." "We're all so friggin' drunk," Winston said as he re-entered the circle. Without warning, he took a swipe at me with his orange cone. I jumped out of the way and brushed up against the bushes. The branches felt very real as they rubbed against the skin covering my ribs. Winston had almost fallen over. The arc of his dramatic swing had extended his body far from his tipsy center of gravity. I was giggling now, but wasn't sure what about. "Hey, what's next?" Henry asked. A nearby streetlight went out. We stood in the park, darker now, and thinking, should we smash something? I had one idea. We could go to Kathy's house. "I'm not going there dressed like this," Winston said seriously. "Come on," I reasoned. "She lives nearby. Why don't you just let her see you for what you really are?" "An overly hairy weirdo," Henry interjected. "You gosh darn jerk," Winston said. He moved suddenly, and I watched, this time from behind Mark, as the orange cone swept through the air and collided with Henry, who exhaled frack and reflexively took off running, leaving the circle. I could tell Winston was nervous. He put his right arm inside the construction cone and aimed it at me like a cannon. "Boom," he said. Mark weighed in on the prospective idea. "Dude, it would be pretty funny if we went to Kathy's." In my group of friends, this was one of the greatest and most irrefutable arguments one could make in support of something. Winston waited a minute, and in that minute a car drove by the park. When its headlights hit the bushes we hid behind, our bodies became imprinted with the patterns of leaves. Henry snuck back into the circle, cautiously eyeing Winston. "All right," Winston said, "I'll go, but you guys have to stand around with me so I don't look like a complete freak." Henry, Mark, and I made eye contact with each other, and without passing judgment, we quietly acknowledged our own less than perfect bodies, variously covered in our old underwear. We waited a moment, weighing this request, before the three of us agreed to accompany Winston. Figuring it was just Kathy, we didn't have anything to prove to her. It would be like we were in our bathing suits. "Crap," Winston said. I peeked through the dense foliage of the bushes and noticed the beacon of a flashlight as it slowly bobbed up and down, approaching the park. I could just make out two distinct forms. "I think someone's walking their dog," I whispered. "Let's go," Mark yelled. The sound of Mark's voice made me shiver, the pure volume of it surprising and exciting me. The four of us burst from the bushes, running and laughing towards Kathy's house. The flashlight swept frantically across the park, the light landing briefly on my body as I sprinted down the street, and the dog kept barking until we were very far away. We stood on the sidewalk in front of an old Spanish-style cottage, Kathy's house. Winston stared straight ahead and whined, "The hell with this, I'm not ready." "We're with you, man." I patted him on the back. His skin felt warm. Winston nodded to himself, then held up a hand and shooed me away, as if my stated support was useless in this situation. He tiptoed across the lawn and went to Kathy's window, which was on the corner of the house leading into the backyard. An old loquat tree shaded this section of the lawn, and Winston stood under it, holding himself. "I'm cold, I'm sobering up," Winston said, turning to look at us. We joined him under the tree and watched as he went and knocked quietly on the frame of Kathy's window, which was covered by a lace curtain. We kept quiet and waited as time passed. I wondered what Anna was doing, if she was at home and feeling sad. I wondered if she was asleep by now, or maybe listening to her music on her headphones in her room, her sister already in bed, the room dark. This train of thought eventually led me to picture Anna in her black underwear, flat on her back, in bed near the stereo, and her skin very white. Tentatively, the curtain covering Kathy's window shifted, and I refocused my attention, keeping my hands over my boxers. Kathy, or someone I hoped was Kathy, was now peeking out. I could only see an eyeball and a bit of forehead. Winston stood in front of us, waving at the shadowy figure, and waited to be evaluated. I leaned over and asked Mark, "What time is it anyway?" "It's hard to say, I'm not wearing a watch." He looked up at the sky and without expertise said, "It's definitely late." The curtain retracted, and I watched Kathy appear, squinty-eyed and her hair flaring out to one side. She began to make vague shooing gestures at Winston. She clarified these gestures by sliding the window open a little and whispering through the screen, "Get out of here." "Okay," Winston said. He stepped back, still waving with one hand, until he fell in line with the rest of us. Once we were all a safe distance from Kathy, she allowed herself to smile and shook her head while doing it. I crossed my arms over my chest, an underwhelming but faithful bodyguard from my friend. I waited for Winston to do something, but he was just grinning. After a minute, Kathy faded into the darkness of her room and pulled the drape across the window. When the stillness had returned, Winston turned to leave. "That was awesome," he said. "It definitely could have been worse," I told him. "I need a drink," Winston decided, before adding, "She did smile at me." "Here," Henry said, "congratulations." It was a Swisher and a lighter. Winston looked at him and then at the cigar. He asked, "Where were you hiding this anyway?" "It was in my shoe. It's still wrapped, though." Gross. Still, Winston eventually lit the cigar and coolly blew some smoke into the night. He put his arm around Henry, and I thought right then that Winston could have been his father, maybe essentially was his father. Mark said, "We still have that 40 at home. Let's go back and resume the circle of life." "Car!" Henry yelled. He was pointing down the street towards a four-way intersection where a stop sign had become illuminated by the headlights of an approaching minivan. I waited a moment and watched as the flashing turn signal indicated that the minivan would be turning onto Cathy Street. It never got old. I began to run. My legs felt weightless, and I could hear my heart beating loudly in my ears. Though I had started after Mark and Henry, I was soon galloping past them, now in the lead. I could only run this perfectly on nights like this, heading towards the dry creek bed that would lead us back to Winston's house. Nearing the edge of the street, Winston shot by me in an all-out sprint, the cigar clamped tightly in his teeth, sticking out the side of his mouth, and he was still obviously smiling. Thanks.